Hi there, everyone. My name is Max, and I'd like to thank you all on behalf of Vroman's Bookstore for tuning into tonight's event with us. Tonight, we're lucky to have with us Nicholas Schmidle, who is going to be in conversation with Buzz Bissinger, discussing Nicholas's new book, Test Gods, Virgin Galactic, and the Making of a Modern Astronaut. Tonight's event does include a Q&A portion, so if you would like to ask Nicholas a question at any point, you can go ahead and click that Ask a Question button towards the bottom, and they will get to that towards the end of the event. And lastly, if you would like to purchase his book from our store, you can go ahead and click that green button right down below, and it'll take you to our store. With that out of the way, I will go ahead and let them take over. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Nice.
Nick, greetings from whatever this is, the screen. For those who are listening, Nick is calling in from London, so it's 2 o'clock in the morning. Is that correct?
That is, yeah.
All right.
Exactly.
So if he's comatose or doesn't make sense, we will forgive him. I'm just here to ask questions. I'm really here to ask questions because I have read this book from beginning to end and fell in love with it. It's called, of course, Test Gods. There's so many different moves to it. It's a swashbuckling story. It's a story of flight. It's a story of excitement. It's a story of speed. It's a story of Richard Branson, who's one of the greatest personalities that we know of. It's a story of Nick's father and what is a very, very complex relationship that we'll talk about. I got to know Nick in 2011 when he wrote the best, and I read the New Yorker because I'm a journalist. I get envious. He did this incredible reconstruction of the Bin Laden raid when Bin Laden was killed. And I kept saying, how the hell did he get that? The detail was incredible. I met him in person when he was teaching at Princeton, and he was kind enough to send me a copy of the book. I will say I get a lot of requests for blurbs. Normally, when I do them, I read, 10 pages, 15 pages, 20 pages. This I read, I couldn't stop reading it. I just found it beautifully written, exciting, much like The Right Stuff, but in a different era on the speed of Branson and Virgin Galactic and the future of space and the future of space travel. So jumping into it, Nick, what sparked your interest in this? I know you were at the New Yorker at the time. Was it 2014? Is that right?
Yeah, that's when I got started. So look, Buzz, thank you. This is truly an honor to be in conversation. And Buzz has been a lifetime hero of mine. We'll get to this later, but when I started reading, and one of the pivotal books that my dad gave me when I was growing up was Friday Night Lights. And so I kind of sat down when I thought about this project from the beginning. It was, how do I take the subject matter of The Right Stuff, and how do I approach it with kind of as if how do I approach it like Friday Night Lights? How do I do a season with this company, right? And that really started in 2014, which is the critical moment and pivotal moment for me is on Halloween of 2014. Virgin Galactic was flying their 4th supersonic test flight, and the vehicle, their spaceship, which maybe it's helpful real quick just to kind of show the configuration here. As you can see on the cover here, they have this very unique air launch system, which uses a wide-winged mothership to carry the spaceship aloft to about 45,000 feet, much like the X-planes of the mid-20th century, the X-1, the X-15. And at that point, the mothership drops the spaceship, the mothership pulls away, and then the spaceship, the 2 test pilots inside the spaceship, which is also a unique distinguisher from the other primary rocket companies, which are mostly automated and are vertically launched. So you've got 2 test pilots in the spaceship. They light the rocket. The rocket flies horizontally for a few seconds, then enters this steep, near vertical ascent to the heavens. And so on this particular morning in October of 2014, the co-pilot ignites the rocket, and a few seconds into the flight commits this sort of unthinkable error.
That's right. I remember.
It's essentially
bizarre. Totally bizarre.
Essentially pulls the emergency brake on the highway. And
yeah, but wait a second. How fast are they going at that point?
They're going 0.8 Mach. They're just approaching Mach 1. And at Mach 1, sort of on either side of Mach 1, is what they call the Transonic Zone. And the Transonic Zone is this, we describe it as kind of the Bermuda Triangle of airspeed. It's this crazy moment on either side of Mach 1 in which just their unexpected and unpredictable aerodynamic forces exert themselves on the vehicle. And the test pilots had always been aware that you have to keep, Spaceship Two has this unique feature as well, where the tail booms rotate up. And the reason for this is that upon re-entry, after they'd gone up to space, they needed to figure out a way to allow the spaceship to make a careful, controlled re-entry. And the idea was that the ship would more or less kind of, imagine a tortilla that folds up like a taco. And that's what the spaceship would do. And it would allow her to sort of float down like a shuttlecock. And so they said, under no circumstances should you ever unlock the feather. The feather is the movable tail boom. Should you ever unlock the feather as you're approaching Mach 1? And for some reason on this morning, the co-pilot did that. And as he did that, the aerodynamic forces pushed the tail booms up and shredded the vehicle apart in midair. And
how many two pilots, the pilot and co-pilot died? How many were killed?
The co-pilot was killed immediately. The co-pilot was killed. The pilot miraculously survived. I mean, there's no ejection seat. He somehow wiggled out of his seat. The parachute, he pulled the parachute, landed in a creosote bush in the middle of the desert and survived. But I remember getting the news alert that day on my phone and kind of wanting to just, after reading the first paragraph or two, wanting to stop for a second. There were so many built-in assumptions into that article. Richard Branson's, space tourism company crashes in the desert. And it was like, wait a second. So there's a British billionaire who owns a spaceship company that has a winged spaceship that has that's flying with test pilots on board, that's flying supersonic test flights and sort of crashing and dying. The stakes suddenly seemed unmistakably high, and it seemed just zany, right? That this was happening. So that was the moment for me that I went to my editor at the New Yorker and said, we have to write about this. This is insane. And his question was, sounds cool, but can we get quote unquote real access, is what he said. And so then my next trip was to go out to California to talk to the then vice president of the company, now president of the company, to figure out if I could get real access. How could I embed with them?
And I'm always curious about that. How did that conversation go? And access is a double-edged sword. Were they reluctant? Were they excited? Did they want certain assurances from you? Were you nervous? You don't get access. There goes this great idea. How did that initial conversation go? And were there other subsequent conversations? How much work did it take?
Took a little bit of work. They were surprisingly receptive. And they were surprisingly receptive, I'll tell you, for a couple of reasons. One of which is that they had just come off of this horrific crash. And I said I wanted to get in there when emotions were raw, and I wanted to watch them work. I wanted to watch them build this new vehicle from scratch. And at that point, the company's PR had primarily been focused on the glitz and the glamour of this 5-star experience that they were offering. And most of that was being driven by their commercial office in London. And Mike Moses, the now president of the company, formerly vice president, saw this as an opportunity to tell the story of the people, the men and women that were out there turning the wrenches, drawing the designs, flying the ship. And so he was surprisingly receptive to the idea.
Right.
I will tell you, the other piece that really sort of helped me get in the door is that the public affairs woman at the time was a huge fan of Friday Night Lights. And I told her that I wanted to write Friday Night Lights. And
so
she said,
I should be getting royalties on this.
Totally. And so that also helped get me across the finish line. But so there was also one other piece to this, which is that one of the pilots, at that point, the pilot corps was 5 people. And one of the pilots I had known had been an F-18 pilot who flew with my dad, and we can get into this later, but I had known 30 years ago. And I hadn't seen him in 25 years. But when I found out that he worked now at Virgin Galactic, I went out there and I met with him, and I sort of, gave him my spiel as to how I worked and how I how I would do this and how the New Yorker's fact-checking apparatus worked and all of that. And I explained to him, and it gave him, he said, look, we've got a lot of stuff written about us, and so much of it has been false. And so, he went to Mike Moses and said, look, I don't know Nick personally. I think all of them were a little mistrusting of journalists. And he said, but look, if we're going to let someone in, this guy seems to come from decent stock. And,
well, your father was the original Maverick, wasn't he? Or Rooster, as he was called. I mean, your father was a really kick-ass pilot for the Marines, was he not?
He was. And so my dad at that time was a 3-star Marine general who was in charge of all aviation for the Marine Corps. And but interestingly, the 3 stars were sort of less important to him, I think, than the fact that he was still at his age. That would have been, he was still in his early 60s at that point, or he was in his early 60s at that point, and he was still flying single seat fighter jets. And he was a legend in the Marine Corps. He got one of a very few distinguished flying crosses, for a mission he flew the first night of the Gulf War. Flew this incredibly ballsy, mission, in Bosnia in 1994. And so he's a legend in the Marine Corps aviation.
And by the way, for you though, there are so mof components to this book. It is a lot like Tracy Kidder's The Soul of the New Machine. I don't know if you ever read that.
Yeah.
But one of the things I like about it is it's fascinating. And I have no engineering background, none. But what they look for, how they put this machine together, what works, what doesn't, and I'm simplifying it, is really marvelous. But another component is this very, very complex relationship, almost ironic, to your dad. And for those out there who haven't read the book, and I hope you buy it, Nick rebelled a little bit. You crashed his Porsche in a ditch. Am I correct?
Yeah, which is interestingly, when the fact checker ran this past my dad, my mom and dad, my dad, I think he was deployed at the time. And he wrote back to the fact checker and said, I have no recollection of that. That was an evening my sophomore year of high school. And I had to figure out a way to get the repairs done. I think there was a tear in the radiator or something that we had to get repaired by the time he got home. So, I think growing up. Do you fly? I don't. And that's,
now, how is that? I'm just curious. I can understand, but why don't you? Your dad is one of the greatest pilots, certainly in the history of the Marine Corps. He loves to fly. You obviously like flying because you're doing this book. Was it rebellion? Was it, I don't want to follow in his footsteps? You did a lot of kick-ass stuff, and there's a question we'll get to. I mean, I think you went to Afghanistan and Pakistan and risked your life and really out there, in the mountains. I think you were trying to get into the Pakistani Taliban, but why not take up flying?
It just never quite, it just never quite sunk in. And I realized, one of the things that I realized in the process of writing this book was that I wasn't really interested in it because I was interested in flight. I was interested, or in aviation. It was because I was interested in the aviators. Right. I was interested in, and that's, I think, even now, at one point, I remember when I started going out to Mojave, California for the book, and one of the pilots said, hey, if you're out here all the time, there's an opportunity for you to get your pilot's license. And I kind of thought about it. And then I thought, I'm just, for some reason, it's not, I can't explain it. It doesn't resonate with me. I go up and I fly with these guys. I flew with the pilots of Virgin Galactic on a number of occasions.
Right.
And I kind of would come down and be like, that was cool. But it helped me understand the experience better. It helped me write about it better, but it wasn't something that animated me. And it's probably, and in some ways, I think it's probably to many people as inexplicable as, the Mike Ellsbury making this crazy mistake on the morning of the October 21st, 2014 flight. It's just kind of like one can't square the circle as to how someone who grew up in my household couldn't have some love of aviation and want to fly.
Was it ever determined as to why he did that? I probably not, but speculation. No. I remember reading that and saying this makes no sense. This is the kind of mistake I would make if I was up there, because I don't know shit about flying. But did anyone ever determine what might have happened?
No,
Did
you know,
he panic?
there was an extensive review by the National Transportation Safety Board, investigation into the accident. And the conclusion was that at the end, no one knows. I mean, they spoke to his wife. And I spoke to his wife as well. I mean, they tried to figure out, was he tired? Was he distracted? You know, the workload, it's worth noting that the workload during the boost portion of these Spaceship Two flights is extraordinarily high. And that's why even among the test pilot community, there is a high degree of respect for the test pilots that are flying Spaceship Two, because in those 60 seconds, I mean, there's very little that's automated. And I mean, these guys there's so much to pay attention to. The margin of error is so thin.
Oh, that's great. So very little is automated. That's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's the way, you know, this thing is a Piper Cub with a rocket motor shoved in the back. I mean, it's really a phenomenon. So as a piloting experience, there is nothing. I mean, these guys say there's nothing like flying Spaceship Two. There's nothing that's comparable. It does, you know, we can talk about this later, but it does raise questions about the viability of the business when there are so many.
And I'm curious about that. You know, well, I'll just ask. And one thing I want to mention to readers out there, what's cool about this book too, it's a story. I mean, he's telling a story. Here's a company run by a very flamboyant individual, Richard Branson, you know, Virgin Airlines, many, many other things. He's going to establish a space tourism business, which sounds pretty wild to begin with, but he does it. And then there's this horrific crash. And it's a story of a company trying to recover from that crash and go on and see if they can, in a sense, build the perfect spaceship. Before I ask about Branson, tell me about Mark Stuckey, who's really the protagonist of this thing. How did you get to him? And I think he knew your father or knew of your father.
Yeah. So when I got out to Mojave, I was looking for someone who could help me tell this story. It was so once I realized that I was going to get this very unique access, it was how do I string this together in a compelling way? And I knew that Mark Stuckey had flown the first 3 powered flights, but had not flown the 4th powered flight. And I later found out that on the 4th powered flight, the co-pilot who made this error and died was Mark Stuckey's best friend. So immediately I thought, okay, well, there's a super compelling storyline. So then I met Mark, and he told me and he shared to me that he's been chasing this astronaut dream his whole life. That at age 4,
That's right.
He watched John Glenn take his maiden flight. He tells his dad that day that his dad comes home from work, and he tells his dad, "That's what I want to do. I want to become an astronaut." And you know, most fathers would humor their children and say, you know, of course you want to become an astronaut, son, anything you want. Mark Stuckey's dad is a conscientious objector and a Mennonite, and tells his son that no way, impossible, no son of his will ever become an astronaut, because all the astronauts come from the military and no son of his is ever going to serve in the military. So Stuckey then goes.
I forgot all this delicious detail.
And Stuckey then goes and you know, like all sort of good rebellious teenagers do and sons do, he goes and joins the Marine Corps, and then he joins NASA, and then he goes into the Air Force. And he's chasing this astronaut dream for decades before he finally gets to Scaled Composites, the company that was contracted to build the spaceship for Virgin Galactic. So when I first met Stuckey, we sat down at this pub near his house. And I kind of explained to him that I saw him as a character, and he immediately to me felt recognizable, right? Like I knew the type in some ways, and we'll talk a little bit about this later about sort of what qualities I saw of my father in him.
Right.
But interestingly, I didn't know this at the time, but he also knew my dad. My dad had been his flight instructor 35 years ago as young Marines in Yuma, Arizona. And so he said, you know, you remind me of somebody else too. And I knew your dad way back when. So it was an interesting moment. And you know, we are often asked, I think, as journalists, why we pick a topic, why we sort of are ready to stick with something for 5 or 6 years to write a book about it. And I think one of the one of the interesting revelations from this process was that we're not the only ones picking, right? Sometimes a subject sometimes we come to a subject and sometimes a subject comes to us. And I think that Mark Stuckey knew that he had lived a phenomenal life and had always kind of been looking for someone to potentially help him tell that story. And, I arrived at just the right time and he arrived in my life at just the right time. And, we've become since really good friends. And that,
Right. Has he read the book?
Pardon? Yeah, he's read the book.
And what did he think?
I mean,
you went pretty deep and he was open, but you went pretty deep with him.
He knew, I mean, after the New Yorker piece, which was raw, and I think some people said to him, what are you thinking? How are you cooperating with this guy still? But I think that he felt like I was fair and that I understood him, and that all the personal stuff, all the stuff about his broken marriage and his, failed relationship with his kids and all that.
Right. That was wrenching. That was really wrenching. It was a great part of the book.
No, thanks. And
that stuff's personal. That's what makes it for greatness, is you got in deep with him. And once again, readers, it's not just they did this, they did that. The backstory of Mark Stuckey, what he went through in his marriage, and really what he went through with his kids is poignant's not the right word, but very deep. And it shows flaws, which is, there's flaws are much more interesting than perfection, basically. And that was a terrific part of the book.
Yeah, thanks. Well, and that's too, I think, is where this notion of kind of a modern astronaut comes from. I mean, there's the modern side of it, which is the commercial space industry and all that. But there's the other side, is that every other portrait of an astronaut that we've read is a set-jawed, perfect complexioned character of great,
the John Glenn sort of stereotype.
Totally. And here comes Mark Stuckey, who's willing to own up to all of these foibles and fallibilities, and to let this reporter sort of rummage around in his email box looking for, salacious details of his divorce and of it, and I told him, I said, look, and this is even with the company, I conveyed this. I said, if you don't let me see the moments of tragedy and you don't let me see the difficulties, then the moment of triumph at the end for both you personally, Mark, and for the company, it isn't going to have the same payoff. And, there were times when there were an incident or two where the company, where people tried to sort of tell me to leave a meeting or tell me to leave the room as there was something sensitive happening. And I just said, these are the moments that are going to redeem the big moment in the end when you all hopefully fly to space. And that, I think, is the same argument that I made to Mark throughout. And fortunately, he sort of saw, which is that, you let someone into the difficulties, and then it makes the success at the end all that much sweeter.
How did Mark Stuckey remind you? Let's talk about your dad a little bit. Growing up, were you intimidated by him, or was it? I know he was away a lot. He was deployed a lot. Did you really know him that well?
It's a great question. So, intimidated, I mean, he was some emotionally distant but towering figure, right? And we're not talking sort of the Bull Meacham, Great Santini. We weren't doing push-ups every morning. My dad's intensity came from the fact that he was, he always wanted to do things differently and a little bit more intense than even the normal way should have been. It wasn't just hunting, but it was hunting wild boars, and it was hunting wild boars with a bow and arrow, and not just a regular bow and arrow, but a bow and arrow, a long bow with arrows that he, fletched in our garage, and, with a 357 Magnum strapped to his leg in case the boars charged. I mean, that was kind of his approach to.
Sounds like fun.
That's how he hunted, right?
Good way to spend a Saturday afternoon, right?
Well, not a Saturday afternoon, as I found out. And this is, hey, Nick, do you want to go hunting with me this weekend? Sure. 3:00 in the morning, roused out of bed. And I'm thinking in the drive to the hour-long drive to the marsh, in which we're towing the boat. And then we get out and we get in the boat and we drive through the marsh in the dark for an hour. And then we pull into the marsh and we get out in our boots and we're sort of slopping through the mud. I mean, when you're 14, you're like, man, this sucks. It's way too early to be doing
But you
that.
clearly got that from him. I mean, for those who don't know, I think it was when you're beginning to be a reporter, you did some really hair-raising stuff. You were challenging life in your own right. So you inherited that sort of wanderlust, so to speak. Just it seems to me in a different way.
Totally.
But was he friendly? I mean, if I met him, I'd be scared shitless. I don't know why. He's so macho.
Well, and so that's the thing. Like so friendly. I mean, he didn't exude warmth,
right?
But my mom more than made up for it. My mom is the sort of the heartbeat of the family, right? And what I have tried to reconcile and to reckon with is I always knew that my dad was setting this expectation for us, for my brother and I, as we got older. And so as I'm writing this and I'm thinking about my relationship with my dad, I'm looking at my relationship with my kids, and I'm thinking, okay, I'm much more present. I'm much more available. I mean, they're fortunately sleeping right now, so they might come down and be like, "Oh, Dad's such a tyrant still." But I'm much more present. But am I setting the same? Like, how do you do both? How are you both physically present and warm, and also being this towering figure that your kids want to sort of constantly be striving to impress? Mm-hmm. And so I knew. When Mark Stuckey described his relationship with his son, I could see it from both ways, right? I knew how difficult it was for his son to have been sort of living as Mark's son. And I also sympathized with Mark when he said, look, my son he's estranged, we're estranged. He doesn't talk to me. And I thought, oh my God, I at that point had a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old. And I thought, you've got to be kidding me. Like how I could never, that was just gut wrenching. So, it's a tough thing. Like my dad, incredibly inspiring, constantly sort of wanted to live up to his expectations. And there's no part of it that I think, I think that I almost appreciate the relationship more now than I did then.
Right.
I think.
Where'd you grow up? Were you all over the place because of his?
In the U.S. We sort of because of where the Marine Corps Air Station bases are. We bounced between Beaufort, South Carolina, where I lived. We had 3 tours there for about 10 years total. Yuma, Arizona, which is comparable to Mojave in its sort of awful middle of nowhereness. And then increasing a lot of time up in Northern Virginia, both between Quantico and the Pentagon. So we kind of those were the 3 main nodes where I bounced between.
Now let's talk about Branson, and in talking about Branson, and this is another important part of the book. At the beginning, I guess the question is, what was this really a lark? Did you think that was a lark? And as the project went on and as you got deeper into the book, you realized, no, Branson is really serious. He sort of sees this as the next frontier. Personally, I know they spent billions and billions of dollars, but it's still, these are very hard charging guys who like challenging the future. And obviously there's Elon Musk. But what was your sense of Branson? Was it for publicity? Was it, what the hell? I want to do something new and different, or how dedicated was he to it?
I think he was very dedicated.
Yeah, surprisingly, frankly.
And here's the reason why. And it's really important to kind of go back and to realize the centrality of this boutique aviation firm that first designed that built Spaceship 2 and that built Spaceship 1 as predecessor, because this explains also why Mike Owsbury made that mistake in 2014 and why there weren't all these fail safes built into the spaceship, which is that. So we rewind to 1996. In 1996, there's a contest to the first $10 million to the first privately built spacecraft that can reach space twice in 2 weeks. Mm-hmm. And the contest is going to, in 2004, the contest is about to expire. And here comes Scaled Composites, this small aviation firm in Mojave. And they build this thing, Spaceship 1, which is a smaller version of Spaceship 2. and they build the White Knight, which is a smaller version of White Knight 2. And they use this unique air launch configuration. And Spaceship One goes to space 3 times that year and makes the 2 qualifying space flights in 2 weeks, wins the X Prize, this $10 million prize. So they've proven the concept that you can do this. And Branson comes around and Branson says, he throws about, I don't know, $1 million towards the project in the end and puts the Virgin logo on the side of Spaceship One and earns the right to commission Rattan to build Burt Rattan and Scaled Composites to build him a bigger version of this craft. So it didn't seem like a lark because, I mean, it might have seemed like a lark before Spaceship One did this, but now that Spaceship One has done this, I mean, Scaled Composites could do anything in many people's. I mean, Scaled Composites had some crazy offers from people coming in. I mean, they had just proven everyone wrong, and so this is the central challenge, right? Because what Scaled Composites did and has done, and anyone who's been to the Air and Space Museum knows Scaled Composites without even knowing them, because Burt Rattan, the head of Scaled Composites, has more designs hanging up in the Air and Space Museum than anyone else.
That guy's he's a remarkable character as well.
I mean, he's a genius. Remarkable. And he but their whole thing is building prototypes, building one-offs. So they don't put a lot of fail-safes into their vehicles. And so now you have this company that is trying to build a certifiable, safe space tourism vehicle. Right. And you can just see that that's going to be that's a recipe for disaster in some ways, right? They don't build redundancy. They build sort of redundancies where they need to be there, but if the redundancy doesn't need to be there, they don't put it in there. And then Virgin Galactic's coming along, and they've got lawyers, and they've got all of these people that are worried about, well, is it going to be safe? And these two companies, while they worked together, it was often the farthest thing from seamless you could imagine. And so the cultural clash between those two I found fascinating as well. And so Branson, though, had good reason to believe, and it's hard to know where Branson's head is now. I mean, he recently sold off $150 million worth of personal stock shares in Virgin Galactic. And, Virgin Galactic's, it's hard to say. I mean, they have more money now than ever because they went public about 1.5 years ago.
Oh, they did. I was wondering what the status is.
I mean, before they went public, they had about $80 million in cash reserves left in their accounts, and they were spending about almost $20 million a month. So money was going to become an issue very quickly.
Right.
They went public. Now they're still spending about $25 million a month, but they have $660 million in cash. So there's a long road in which they can continue to kind of try and figure this out. But the fact that Branson has pulled his money out recently, or pulled out a large chunk of it, does raise questions as to where his head is now as to the viability of this whole venture.
Is it a viable concept? It's interesting. We've been reading a lot. There's a lot in the news recently about Elon Musk and what's he doing and how much progress. Is it really a viable concept? I know you can get people who want to do it and will pay the entrance fee, whatever the hell it is. But can it work?
I think it can work for Elon. I mean, I think that what Elon and SpaceX are building, I think that it's doable. Mm-hmm. I think that the challenge that Virgin Galactic has is that its configuration just leaves it exposed to so many more. It leaves it so much more exposed because you have a man in the loop, 2 men in the loop, right? Which as the 2004 accident showed, you can have the most extremely well qualified and trained pilots, and sometimes they still have bad days.
Right.
And also, this isn't an airplane company that built a spaceship, and this is not a spaceship company that built a spaceship. Scaled Composites its DNA is as an aircraft company, and Virgin Galactic's DNA is as an aircraft company. And the vertical takeoff and vertical launch approach that Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic's main competitor, and SpaceX use just seems to have more long-term viability. It seems to be, I mean, that I think is probably going to be the way. That's not to write Virgin Galactic off totally, but their prognosis of where they will be in a few years is still infused with a magical thinking that they're going to be flying, weekly flights with this thing. And they only have one mothership. I mean, if the mothership goes down for any period of time, they're screwed.
Right.
And so that's kind of that's top view of, I think, where the viability is in the coming years.
I just want to tell people who are out there, we're certainly open to questions. So pop them in, please. A few people have commented. This is from Joe Lapp. He actually wanted to know, how did getting access to Firebrand clerics in Pakistan help you get access to Virgin Galactic? And he admitted that he had to get work Pakistan in there somewhere. And someone else, I think it was Joe also, he was the son of a Mennonite pastor, and he loved airplanes as well, but he did not join the military. Now, you do this book. When you set out to do the New Yorker piece, were you anticipating that it would be a book? Or did it grow into a book?
I knew after the first couple of trips out there, I knew the level of access that I had. I knew the fact they were letting me sit in on these meetings and record these meetings, and the granularity and the detail and the scale and the ambition of what they were trying to do felt to me relatively soon like there was a book potential there. But it took a while to kind of wrestle. I mean, it even took a while just to figure out what the story was. I think the first couple of versions, I just had too many characters. I had too many it was too flat. I couldn't figure out where the arc was. So it took me a while to really kind of continue to winnow out everything that wasn't Stuckey. And then to figure out, okay, what enhances his story for the magazine piece, which was long in and of itself, what enhances his story and what doesn't sort of get it out. And then when I could come back for the book, it was all, you mentioned earlier that it wasn't just kind of one episode after another. It was really helpful to have his story as the spine and to figure out what sort of feeds into it. What do you need to know in terms of history and backstory to be able to further understand his story?
That's an enormous trick, as you know, in writing narrative nonfiction. It's something that I grapple with in every book, is how do you balance the character, the spine, with the spokes. I see it as a bicycle wheel, and you have the hub and then you have the spokes, but do the spokes get in the way of the narrative? Do they slow it down? Because I think we're sort of drawn to character. On the other hand, books can be, books are wonderful because they have context, and if you don't put in some of that history and some of that other stuff, it doesn't have the context. And I felt you pulled it off really, really, nicely, and really well. Now, this is in the afterword, and I was really curious. It didn't affect the book, but I was curious just emotionally. They pull access on you. I think they say go for it. It's 2014.
Yeah.
2018, Mark Moses, who is now the president, correct?
Yeah, Mike Moses.
Says, all right, you're done. Was that in response to the New Yorker piece? Were they nervous about something? Were they trying to hide something? I mean, you've been there for 4 years. What happened?
So there were. The idea was always that I would stick with them until they flew the 5th powered flight, right? I wanted to stick with them until they flew this first rocket powered flight after they'd built the new spaceship.
Right.
I knew there was something. I knew there was something that was different and that was going to affect the relationship. There were a couple of critical junctures, one of which is that on the morning of that 5th powered flight, which was in April of 2018, I had up until that point not been denied access. I had not been told that I couldn't come into a single meeting. I would ask, they'd say sure. I think there was one occasion when they were talking about like a manpower human resources thing where they said, look, you really can't record. You can listen for context, but this is the only meeting you can't record.
Right. So
that flight happened, and that April 2018 flight, and I was walking in and I was barred entry. And the person who barred my entry was this guy named Stephen Attenborough. And
now, who is he in the company? What's his title?
He is, I think, employee number 1. He is a commercial director.
Employee number 1. What does that mean?
It means that when Branson first came up with this idea in 2014, Stephen Attenborough was the guy who was going to sell the tickets. It was the guy who was going to market the company and sort of focus on the customer experience, right? I mean, he was the guy who was he was all glitz and glamour. I mean, this is what he was selling.
Right.
And I knew that Attenborough didn't like the fact that I was embedded, and that he felt, Attenborough very much was controlling of the PR narrative. He wanted to be focused on the sponsorship deals with Land Rover and Grey Goose, and and all of a sudden now there's this reporter that's running around that, there's wow, what do we do with this guy, right? So the magazine piece comes out in August of 18, and Mike Moses said to me, the piece came out on a Monday, and I remember on like Thursday, I called Moses and I said, I've got this book deal, and I'm ready to get back in. And Moses said, okay, give me a week or so. I need to work out some diplomatic things. There are some people who thought the magazine piece made what we're doing sound exceedingly dangerous. And of course, I'm like, well, guys, you've got three engineers who were killed in the 2007 accident, and a test pilot who was just killed a few years ago. Like, what do you mean? I'm not the one making it sound dangerous. And
that's ridiculous, actually.
Right? And so they, so then became this sort of this fight for the soul of the company in some ways, where I'm in one ear trying to say, I'm going to tell the story. And I knew that Richard liked the magazine piece. He'd emailed me and said to me about 3 weeks after the magazine piece came out, he emailed me and said to me, he was reluctant to do this because he didn't want to be seen as stomping on journalist independence, but that he appreciated all the time and effort that went into it. And, we saw there was an opportunity for me to continue doing what I wanted to do. And then I met him again in December of 18. He reiterated that, but they kept just dragging their feet. They kept talking about how they had, deals with other books that turned out to just be, they were just non-issues. They were just making up these things to kind of, to prevent me from being in. And then the critical moment was that I had this one-on-one relationship with Branson, and he had, without telling anyone else at the company, invited me down to the British Virgin Islands and to spend a couple of days talking about the company. And then 2 days before I was set to leave, I, to my, great, I should have never mentioned this, but I let it slip to his PR guy that I was on my way down to the British Virgin Islands. And suddenly, all the alarms were going off, and Attenborough called me and said, look, Richard's not going to be the one to do this, but you can't come. And yeah, so you asked sort of how I felt. I remember being really, really, really scared that I wasn't going to be able to pull this off, and pissed off. And I remember my dad having this conversation with my dad that night, and he said, do what you get. Like, you have a book to write. And, that's the priority. And all this, like, I knew that I had what I needed at that point. I had Mark Stuckey going to space. I had Virgin Galactic flying its first non-test pilot to space. They had these two successful flights in December of 18, February of 19. And in some ways it was a blessing in disguise, because it gave me some distance, right? It let me say, okay, I have my material. Now I can write about this soberly and realistically, and I'm no longer fighting for access. And, so in some ways I think it was kind of the best thing that could have happened. But yeah, I was really
That's a good point, though. Access for a writer is a double-edged sword. You can get buried really, really deep. You develop relationships. You have to. You end up liking people. So to be able to step back and look at it with sober eyes is tricky. And so in a way, I think it's probably good. And you can get addicted to access as well. Access begets more access. So I didn't really think about that. And the fact that they cut it off, and it did enable you to step back. Here's a question. How did writing this book affect your own life? I know you made, 14 trips to Mojave, or 15, and your relationships with the book's character and with the people in your own sphere, so to speak. Yeah. Are you on good relationships? Are there some people talking to you, some people not? I think Stuckey, how did Stuckey feel? You put him out there. How did he feel about it?
I think he feels that I know that he, because I told him over the course of the writing that I felt like our relationship was different. It wasn't the traditional journalist source, journalist subject relationship. It transcended all of those sort of normal boundaries, right? And there was this moment that kind of brought that to light, which is when he became an astronaut. When he flew to space the first time in December of 2018, he lands, And I'm watching his wife, give him hugs, and I'm watching his son, give him hugs. And I was behind his son, and I was, kind of next up. And I was like, all right, well, what's the right thing for me to do here? Because a reporter reaches out his hand and says, nice job. Or, there's a simple compliment. But like a friend, gives the guy a bear hug. And, and I reached out and I gave him a handshake, and it felt just weird and sterile. And so, I reached around for the other arm and gave him a hug. And I feel like that, he is more than that. And he is a friend. And, it's a unique relationship when you have a friend who you're writing about, who knows that you're going to write things that are not complimentary, not damaging. Like, I wasn't out to damage him, but there were things that didn't make him look great. And he was okay with it. I mean, he knew when I was talking to his ex-wife that what she was going to say wasn't going to make him look great. But he
knew that. I mean, it wasn't.
But he knew that, and there was never. I mean, I asked him for access to everyone and family members, and he was cooperative to the end. And he's read the book, and I think that he feels the only time that he's sort of been reserved. I mean, he says it's hard for me to comment on it because it's all about me. Right. But he, people have written to him very complimentary things and said, like you engaging with, you being willing to cooperate with this process gives me a whole new insight into who you are. And he's shared those with me. And I think he's really pleased with the way it turned out.
What is he doing now?
He's still at Virgin Galactic, waiting to fly. Waiting to fly hopefully the next rocket ship flight sometime this month, potentially.
Well, any regrets about doing the book? Anything you would have done differently? You said you had an assistant researcher. That fascinated me. I think a former student that, according to you, really, really saved your ass in a lot of places and became a very, very good reader. When you did your first draft, you read it, and we all read our first drafts, and then fear begins to set in. What was the problem? Was it you were too much over the map? Were there too many characters? Was it that the narrative wasn't driving the way you wanted it to? What were the problems? And how did you go about fixing them?
The hardest part was writing about my dad, because the back third of the book, where it's kind of them charging to space, came really, really easy, because it was the combination of natural action and a lot of access and a lot of documentary materials that let me piece together space flights with granular detail. Right. The middle third was always my concern. That's as book writers, you people talk about the saggy middle, right? Like, how do you sort of maintain that tension? And that's where I knew I wanted to introduce the personal side of the story. And Tess Bissell, who was a former student of mine at Princeton when you came and kindly spoke in the class, and she read various versions of that, and some she said, look, I think you probably have 12 pages too much of stuff about your dad, or 12 pages too much of stuff about sort of you, where it's so clear in these pages that you're trying to figure out what it is you want to say. And that's what it was. I knew that my dad was central to me telling the story and why I wanted to come to the story and what had drawn me to the story. But I was always worried that it was going to feel pasted on or extraneous. And I needed to figure out how to make it seem organic and natural. And she very much helped me do that.
I mean, I think it gave the book a really, really special personal dimension that it needed. But, it's a narrative issue. Did you ever think about getting rid of it? I mean, I go through it all the time now.
I did, and
I'm
I
glad
did.
you did, because it gave the book a dimension that, went above just this happened and that happened. There was something really went to the core of your soul, which I thought was really cool.
Well, thanks. I mean, I only thought about doing it initially when I thought about what kind of book. It didn't come to me really until I sat down and started writing the book itself, because even in the magazine piece, right. I mean, I had like a parenthetical about my dad. I mean, I think there were like maybe 8 words in the magazine piece that referred to my dad, but I knew in the book that I wanted to blow this out bigger. But I wasn't sure how to do it. And like I said, Tess is the one who kind of held my hand, and she also would read things and just say, I think you've overwritten that sentence a bit much, or you need to see sort of, sections that digress too far from the central storyline, which is Stuckey. She said, is there a way to sort of tie him back in here, or to tie, you're sort of go on this digression about adventurism and the values that you inherited. Is there a way to bring Stuckey's story back in here? And so those narrative reminders along the way were just, and it was helpful because she had been a student of mine. I had imparted all of these values that I had learned over the years. And then she, in some ways, just sort of held up a mirror and said, don't forget, this is what you told us the third week of class. And
yeah, I've
so
been through
it was
that.
giving me a dose of my own medicine. And really, I cannot imagine doing this book without her.
How long did it take you to write? Of course, you were really innocent. You were living it for 4 or 5 years, basically.
Right.
How
and
long
then
did it take to write?
2 years, more or less. August of 18 to August of 20, I was sort of nonstop. And then, but doing a couple of other things along the way. And then really when the pandemic hit, I was probably a third of the way into writing. And then, I had the next 7 months of just having nothing else to do. And so that gave me, that let me really kind of make I'm not sure how also I'm not sure I had allotted myself enough time minus a forced quarantine pandemic writing period.
Now time is running short, but I'm just curious, how high do they go up, and what's the top speed?
Yeah. So this is actually a subject of some controversy because
that's right.
Most of the world defines space as 100 kilometers and 328,000 feet. Virgin Galactic is using the U.S. Air Force's definition of space, which is 264,000 feet. And so it's just still, look, you look at the pictures of them looking down on the Earth, you're in space. Amazing. Stuff's floating in the cockpit. The big blue Earth is down below. Like it's space. They're going almost Mach 3 to get there.
So miles per hour. How fast is it?
Yeah. So, this is, I always wanted to try and ground this. Always. I'd come back and I'd be like, give me some real numbers. How fast are you going? They say, well, it all, depends. So Mach 1 is roughly, give or take, about 700 miles an hour.
Okay.
So, you could extract, but as you're going higher, then it's all kind of varying because altitude and airspeed is adjusting. And this is where I get into very uncomfortable territory. This is where the limitations of my aviation speak, hit the reality. But
would you say close to 2,000? Is that outlandish?
Yeah. I think that's yeah.
Wow.
And listening to Stuckey describe, I remember that the night of his space flight, I said, well, what did it feel like? And he said, that he'd never felt more sure of anything in his life at that point. Like they're going almost Mach 3. And he said, at a certain point though, you rumble through the sort of thick air and you get into the thinner air and the rocket motor is burning full speed. The rocket motor is burning full on and you're going, nearly 3 times the speed of sound. And he said, it just felt like a thoroughbred. Like she just wanted to run and run and run. And, you could hear the excitement in his voice. And I spent that evening with him drinking whiskey back at his house.
That's right.
You'll appreciate this. So Stuckey had spent a couple of years in the Air Force at one of these black sites. One of the Area 51 Nevada sort of top secret sites. And this is one of the more challenging parts to report and write about the book because he was so cagey about talking about the details of this. And so that night of the space flight, he says, I've got this bottle of whiskey and I've been saving it for a special moment. So he goes and he fetches this bottle of whiskey that his wife Cheryl had bought for him. And then he comes back with a rack of shot glasses. And the shot glasses each of them are embossed with one of the squadrons from these Area 51 Tonopah sites. And he won't answer questions about any of them. He'll just sort of, give me these knowing smirks when I say like, well, I think I've read a little bit about this one, The Dark Knight. What are they, what are they doing again? And he'd just be like, you got it. Like I'm not going to go to jail for this project, So he takes out this bottle of whiskey. He pours us he asked me how I wanted. I said, whatever you're going to do. He said, well, let's take a shot. So he pours us 2 shots. I don't drink whiskey. I haven't drank whiskey probably since college. And so I think we're like taking shots, not that we're going to sip whiskey out of shot glasses. And so, we clink, and then I take this shot, and he looks at me, and I could see that I couldn't tell if he was offended or like impressed or what it was. And he said, well, no, I just meant we were going to sip it. And then I got back to my hotel that night, and I looked it up, and it was like a $600 bottle of whiskey. And I thought, oh my God, I feel like such a bumpkin here. So, but that was like the intimacy of the relationship, though, which is that, the night of his sort of crowning achievement, it's me and him and his wife sitting around the kitchen island table, talking about the day. So it was a very, 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 very unique and memorable relationship.
Now, you went up in some flights. How high did you get? Did you hit space?
No, I went up. So they have this little acrobatic trainer aircraft called an Extra that they fly up there, and it builds up their G tolerance, right? And they take this thing and they do loops and spins and all that. So they brought me up in that thing. I went flying with them in that thing 4 times, and it kicked my ass, right? And made me think that I was going to vomit and all of that. But we probably only went 10,000 feet high. But, you go 10,000 feet high, and then they they intentionally stall the aircraft, and we spin upside down for 1,000 feet or 2 and look like you're going to crash. And then they pull out of that. And this is for them. This is like going to the gym. This is what they do to.
How was it for you? Did you vomit?
No, but very, very close. The first 2 times, extraordinarily close. And I constantly had my little sort of vomit bag under my leg in the aircraft that I'm ready to reach for at a moment's notice. But no, I managed to hold my stuff together.
We're about out of time. I just want to read what I wrote because I really mean it. This is for Test Gods, obviously. It's hard to know where to begin. Test Gods is unique, fascinating, compulsively readable, brilliantly reported with unprecedented access, and a kick-ass adventure story of the last of the great swashbucklers who are addicted to speed and altitude. It is a journey unlike any I have ever read, as pulsating as it is poignant and personal. What makes a man routinely risk his life for a living up teen miles above the clouds? What does he leave behind on Earth? Cosmic questions that Schmidle answers with elegance and beauty and pace. Just strap yourself in and get ready for one hell of a ride. And I meant every word, and I don't do this. I do this very, very rarely. So folks out there, we're just about out of time. Please get the book, read it for yourself, and everything I said in that blurb, I really, really mean it. You did a great job, and we got like 2 minutes left. What are you working on now? Are you back at the New Yorker?
It's a good question. I'm trying to figure out what I want to do now. After you've been, I actually could use some advice from you. After you finish a book project like this, I mean, I both want to sleep and I also kind of want to get back to work. And I'm trying to figure out what's going to scratch that itch. Do I look for sort of small?
I vote for sleep. I vote for sleep. Yeah,
so
I mean,
I'm trying to figure out what
I would go for. You don't need to sleep, but you've been through a hell of a process. I would go for small pleasures, and then you'll know. I mean, in a few months, I take too long in between books. They take a lot out of me. But you'll know, you'll feel it. It's all about getting the right story. Something's going to hit you, and you've done it. Is this your first book?
Second book. I wrote a book about Pakistan as well, but this was far more personal and probing.
Well, you're going to know. Something's going to come across your desk, or you're going to read something, and it's going to be short and 3 paragraphs, and you have the instincts to know this is a book. And then you let it sit for a while. And if you still think it's a book a month later, then it is a book because you've done it and you're a pro and you're really, really talented. Anyway, guys, for all of you who are listening, thanks a lot. Nick, get some sleep. It's now 3 a.m. in London, and you deserve some rest. I'm on the West Coast where it's a very boring 7 o'clock. But it's good to see you again. And thanks, everyone, for
Thanks, Buzz.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Vroman. Appreciate it. It's been fun.
Yes, thank you.